Everyone in first class fell silent as they watched Derek Washington, the decorated Navy captain, being forced to move to the back of the plane, despite his uniform and medals. His dark skin had just made him unwelcome in first class, according to the head flight attendant. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that subscribe button and like this video if you've ever witnessed discrimination or stood up against injustice. The details of what happened next will leave you speechless. Captain Derek Washington's military career was nothing short of exemplary. At 43 years old, the African-American naval officer had dedicated over 2 decades of his life to serving a country that hadn't always served people who looked like him. His broad shoulders carried the weight of responsibility with the same ease. They bore his impeccably pressed uniform, adorned with rows of medals that told stories of valor and sacrifice few civilians could comprehend. Derek was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, finishing in the top 10% of his class despite the additional hurdles he faced. As one of the few black students in his year, his subsequent career had been marked by one achievement after another: multiple tours in high-tension regions, command positions that showcased his leadership abilities, and most recently, captaining ships in the Persian Gulf during critical operations that earned him commendations from the highest levels of military command. On this particular day, Captain Washington was flying home to San Diego after receiving yet another commendation in Washington, D.C. The ceremony had been attended by admirals and even a senator, all praising his tactical innovations that had saved both American lives and millions in taxpayer dollars. As he boarded the flight in his full-dress uniform, the blue fabric crisp and medals catching the light, he felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. Home meant returning to Eleanor, his college sweetheart and wife of 18 years, whose support had been his anchor through deployments and relocations. It meant seeing his children, 14-year-old Zoe, who was already talking about Annapolis herself, and 11-year-old Tyler, who collected model ships in imitation of his father. After weeks away, Derek could almost feel their embraces as he settled into his first-class seat, a rare luxury he had splurged on using his accumulated miles. Throughout his career, Derek had grown accustomed to a certain level of respect when in uniform. Strangers would thank him for his service, occasionally buy his coffee, or simply offer a respectful nod. Just that morning, an elderly white veteran at the airport terminal had approached him with a shaky salute and tears in his eyes, thanking him for continuing the tradition of service. "You know, son," the man had said, his voice wavering with emotion, "when I served in Vietnam, we didn't have many black officers. Seeing you with those captain's bars makes me proud of how far we've come." Derek had returned the salute crisply and thanked the veteran for his own service, even as a part of him wondered how far they'd really come. The distance between how America celebrated its military in the abstract and how it sometimes treated black service members in reality was a gap Derek had navigated his entire career. His father, Harold Washington, had been a Vietnam veteran who returned home to face discrimination despite his Purple Heart. He had instilled in Derek a complex patriotism, love of country paired with a clear-eyed view of its imperfections. "Serving doesn't mean being blind to the flaws," his father often said. "It means believing so much in what America could be that you're willing to be part of making it better." Derek carried that philosophy into his daily life in the Navy. He mentored young sailors of all backgrounds, created inclusive leadership practices that became models for other commands, and navigated the occasionally choppy waters of being one of the few black officers at his rank. He didn't seek special treatment, just the same respect accorded to anyone who had earned their position through merit and hard work. The memory of his father's face when Derek had been accepted to Annapolis still brought warmth to his chest. Harold Washington had stood straighter that day, pulling out his own wrinkled uniform from the back of the closet to iron it meticulously. "You're going to go further than I ever could," he had said, helping his son pack, "and every step you take opens the door wider for the next generation." As the first in his family to attend college, let alone the prestigious Naval Academy, Derek had felt the weight of those expectations. There were moments during his plebe year when the isolation and occasional microaggressions from classmates had tempted him to quit, but the thought of his father's pride kept him going through prolonged physical training, demanding academics, and the unique challenges of being one of the few black midshipmen. 25 years later, Captain Washington had more than fulfilled his father's hopes. His career had taken him around the world, put him in command of billions of dollars worth of naval assets, and earned him the respect of superiors and subordinates alike. The Navy, for all its historical issues with integration, had ultimately provided a meritocracy where his skills could shine. The same could not always be said for civilian life, where the uniform sometimes seemed to matter less than the skin beneath it. As the boarding process continued around him, Derek stowed his small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his window seat. In the first row of first class, he had splurged on the premium ticket using his accumulated miles as a treat. After weeks of grueling work and separation from family, after ensuring his uniform remained unwrinkled, he pulled out his phone to send a quick text to Eleanor. "Boarding now. Can't wait to see you. And the kids love you." The plane was a Boeing 787, one of the newer models in the airline's fleet, with spacious first-class accommodations that promised a comfortable journey across the country. As more passengers filed past him toward the back of the aircraft, several nodded respectfully at his uniform or offered quiet thanks for his service. An older woman paused to say her son was in the Navy too, stationed in Norfolk. These brief connections were common for service members in uniform, a reminder of the broader community they represented. Captain Washington took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat, allowing himself to relax for the first time in weeks. In a few hours, he would be home with his family, away from the responsibilities of command for a brief, precious leave. He had no way of knowing that this routine flight was about to become a battlefield of a different kind, one where his rank and decorations would prove insufficient armor against the most persistent enemy many Black Americans face: the assumption that they don't belong in spaces reserved for others. The initial boarding process had gone smoothly enough. Captain Washington had presented his ticket at the gate, receiving the standard preferential boarding offered to military personnel. Several crew members had greeted him warmly as he stepped onto the aircraft, one young male flight attendant even offering a respectful "Thank you for your service, sir," as he directed him toward the first-class cabin. Derek settled into seat 2A, a spacious window position that would give him both privacy and a view during the cross-country flight. He carefully arranged his uniform cap on the empty seat beside him and pulled out a book on naval history he'd been meaning to finish. The first-class cabin was gradually filling with the usual mix of business travelers in expensive suits and vacationers treating themselves to premium service. That's when he first noticed her. Brenda Collins had been with the airline for 15 years, working her way up to head flight attendant on premium routes. She was a middle-aged white woman with meticulously applied makeup and blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that emphasized her sharp features. Her customer service smile vanished the moment she spotted Derek in the first-class cabin, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of suspicion. "Ticket, please," she demanded without preamble, her tone notably different from the warm greetings she'd been offering other first-class passengers. Derek looked up from his book, momentarily confused, since his ticket had already been checked at the gate and by another crew member upon boarding. Nevertheless, he reached for his boarding pass in his breast pocket. "Here you go," he said politely, handing over the document that clearly showed his assigned seat in first class. Brenda studied the ticket with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "How did you get this seat?" she asked, making no effort to lower her voice. "I used my frequent flyer miles," Derek explained calmly, aware that several nearby passengers were now watching the interaction. "I fly this route often." Brenda responded, reluctantly handing back his ticket. "Well, just make sure you're in the right seat. We have a full flight today." The implication that he might be confused or deliberately sitting in the wrong section hung in the air. Derek returned to his book, choosing to let the moment pass rather than escalate the situation. As a black man in America, he had developed what his wife called his professional calm, the ability to let slights roll off him in public spaces. It was an unfortunate skill honed through necessity. 20 minutes later, as pre-flight service began, Brenda returned to the first-class cabin with drinks for the passengers. She moved methodically from row to row, offering champagne, orange juice, or water with a practiced smile. When she reached Derek, however, she moved past him without stopping. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could I get some water, please?" Brenda turned back with visible reluctance. "Coach service will begin after takeoff," she said dismissively. "I'm in first class," Derek reminded her, keeping his voice level despite the obvious slight. Seat 2A. A few seats away, Howard Fitzgerald, a 60-something executive in an expensive suit, watched the exchange with growing agitation. He was a regular on this route, the kind of customer the airline cultivated with upgrades and personalized service. The sight of Derek in uniform seemed to particularly irritate him. "Is there a problem?" Howard called out, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "Some of us paid good money to be here." The emphasis on "some of us" made the subtext clear. People like Derek didn't belong in premium cabins. Brenda glanced between Howard and Derek, a slight smirk crossing her face before she composed herself. "No problem, Mr. Fitzgerald. I'll bring water right away," she said, the warmth in her voice a stark contrast to her interaction with Derek. The other passengers in first class had various reactions. A few stared intently at their phones or magazines, uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to intervene. Others exchanged knowing glances with Howard, creating a silent coalition of disapproval. Only one or two showed visible discomfort with the treatment Derek was receiving. When Brenda returned with water, she practically dropped the glass on Derek's tray table, causing some to splash onto his uniform. "Oops," she said without sincerity. Turbulence. The plane was still at the gate. Derek dabbed at his uniform with a napkin, maintaining his composure through practiced self-control. He had faced discrimination before, both subtle and overt, but rarely with such boldness while in uniform. Usually, the symbols of his service created at least a veneer of respect, even from those who might harbor prejudice. As boarding completed, and the doors were about to close, Brenda made one more pass through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and tray tables stowed. When she reached Derek, she paused. "You know," she said in a voice just low enough to maintain plausible deniability, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Many of our military personnel might be more comfortable in the main cabin, where there's more room to stretch out. First class can be quite confined." The suggestion was as transparent as it was insulting, an attempt to move him to the back of the plane. While framing it as doing him a favor, Derek met her gaze steadily. "I'm quite comfortable here in the seat I booked, thank you," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well commanding naval vessels. Howard Fitzgerald chose that moment to interject again. "Stewardess," he called, using the outdated term deliberately. "I think we have a situation that needs handling. Some people just don't understand the etiquette of first-class travel." Brenda nodded conspiratorially at Howard. "I'll take care of it, sir. We want all our premium passengers to have an enjoyable experience." The emphasis on premium made it clear who she considered worthy of that designation. The plane pushed back from the gate, momentarily pausing the confrontation as the safety demonstration began. Derek focused on the familiar routine, using the moment to center himself and consider his options. He had done nothing wrong and had every right to the seat he had booked, yet he was being treated like an interloper. The situation was escalating in a way that felt both familiar and freshly painful, another reminder that his achievements and service could still be rendered invisible by the color of his skin. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Derek made a decision. He would stand his ground calmly but firmly. He would not allow himself to be moved from the seat he had rightfully booked, but neither would he create a scene that might be twisted against him later. It was a delicate balance he had navigated many times before, asserting his dignity without fulfilling stereotypes about angry black men that could be used to justify mistreatment. What he didn't know was that Brenda Collins had already made a decision of her own. As soon as the seatbelt sign was turned off after takeoff, she would escalate the situation further, setting in motion events that would ultimately have consequences far beyond this single flight. The brewing confrontation was about much more than a seat assignment. It was about who gets to occupy spaces of privilege and power in America, and who is presumed not to belong. Have you ever watched someone be systematically stripped of their dignity in public? The kind of slow, deliberate humiliation that unfolds like a car crash in slow motion, leaving witnesses simultaneously horrified and paralyzed. This is what happened to Captain Derek Washington 30,000 feet above the American heartland. The seatbelt sign had barely blinked off when Brenda Collins returned to first class, this time with reinforcements. Vincent Reynolds was the chief purser on the flight, a tall man with thinning hair and the practiced authority of someone who had been managing cabin crews for decades. He stood beside Brenda, arms crossed, as she addressed Derek. "Sir, we've received complaints about disruptive behavior," she announced, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. The fabricated accusation hung in the air, creating a pretext for what was about to happen. Derek looked up from his book, genuine confusion crossing his face. "Disruptive behavior? I've been sitting quietly reading." Vincent stepped forward, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation. "Several passengers have reported feeling uncomfortable with your presence in the cabin. In the interest of maintaining a peaceful environment, we need to relocate you." The accusation was as false as it was transparent. Derek had done nothing but exist in a space some felt he didn't deserve to occupy. He looked around at the other passengers, searching for allies. Most avoided his gaze, suddenly fascinated by their entertainment screens or the safety cards in their seatbacks. Howard Fitzgerald, however, watched with undisguised satisfaction. "I haven't disturbed anyone," Derek stated firmly. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat, which I paid for with my frequent flyer miles. There's no legitimate reason to move me." Another passenger, a woman in her 50s wearing designer clothing and excessive jewelry, chimed in. "He's been glaring at people since we took off. It's intimidating." Derek was stunned. He had done no such thing, having been focused on his book since boarding. The fabrication was so brazen it momentarily left him speechless. Vincent seized on his silence. "Sir, we need to accommodate all our passengers' comfort. We have several actual first-class passengers who have expressed concerns." "Actual first-class passengers," Derek repeated, the implication crystal clear. Despite his ticket, his uniform, his rank, he wasn't being considered a legitimate occupant of the premium cabin. "I am an actual first-class passenger. Here's my boarding pass again." He reached into his pocket and produced the document. Vincent barely glanced at it. "Be that as it may, we have the authority to reassign seating for the comfort and safety of all passengers." As this confrontation unfolded, other passengers throughout the cabin had begun to notice. Some in the coach section strained to see what was happening, while the atmosphere in first class had grown thick with tension. A few passengers looked uncomfortable with what was transpiring, but remained silent. Standing slightly behind Vincent was a younger flight attendant, Alicia Martinez. Her dark eyes reflected clear discomfort with the situation, but as the most junior crew member present, she remained silent, occasionally glancing between Derek and her superiors with barely concealed distress. "This is discrimination," Derek stated clearly, naming the situation for what it was. "I have a valid ticket for this seat. I haven't violated any rules or policies. You're asking me to move because of assumptions you've made based on how I look." Brenda's face hardened. "No one mentioned anything about how you look. This is about behavior and ensuring a comfortable experience for everyone." "What specific behavior?" Derek challenged. "Please explain exactly what I've done that's disruptive." Unable to cite any actual misconduct, Vincent changed tactics. "Sir, if you continue to argue, we'll be forced to consider this a security issue. Now, there's an open seat in row 32 that we can move you to. Row 30 to the very back of the plane, next to the lavatories." The symbolism couldn't have been clearer if they'd posted a colored section sign. Derek felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the tension of navigating a situation where standing up for himself could escalate into something dangerous. As a naval officer, he was trained to assess threats and make strategic decisions, right? Now, he was calculating the risks of resistance versus compliance, all while maintaining the dignity his uniform represented. "I want to speak to the captain of this aircraft," Derek requested, knowing that the flight deck crew might intervene in such a situation. "The captain is busy flying the plane," Brenda responded dismissively. "He's delegated cabin authority to us, and we're telling you that you need to move." What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media within hours. Vincent motioned to the back of the plane, where two flight attendants and a sky marshal were now waiting. "If you won't move voluntarily, we'll have to escort you." The message was clear: move or be moved, possibly in handcuffs. In that moment, Derek made a calculation familiar to many Black Americans: whether this particular hill was worth dying on, with cameras potentially recording and the risk of being portrayed as the aggressor regardless of what actually happened. He chose strategic retreat over principled resistance. "I'll file a formal complaint with the airline and the FAA," he said, standing and gathering his belongings with deliberate dignity. "What's happening right now is both unprofessional and illegal." As Derek moved into the aisle, Vincent placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him. A final, unnecessary humiliation, adding physical dominance to the public shaming. Derek stiffened but didn't react, conscious of how any physical response might be interpreted. The walk of shame down the length of the aircraft felt endless. Dozens of eyes tracked his progress, some confused, others embarrassed on his behalf, a few showing naked contempt. Derek kept his gaze forward, shoulders back, channeling the parade ground posture that had carried him through 2 decades of military service. In row 32, Derek found himself seated between 2 passengers who had witnessed his removal from first class. To his left sat Dr. Gabriella Thompson, a woman who would soon play a crucial role in what followed. To his right was an elderly man who whispered, "That wasn't right, what they did to you," before lapsing into uncomfortable silence. As Brenda passed by with the beverage cart some time later, she pointedly served everyone in the row except Derek. It was a final, petty assertion of power, denying him even the basic service others received. Throughout the remainder of the flight, Derek sat straight back in the cramped coach seat, his uniform a stark reminder of the disconnect between America's professed values and its lived realities. He had commanded nuclear-powered vessels, led hundreds of sailors, and received commendations from admirals. Yet here he was, relegated to the back of the plane because his presence had made some passengers uncomfortable. What happened to Captain Derek Washington that day? Was it just one more example of everyday racism? Or was it a turning point that would lead to consequences no one on that flight could have predicted? Do you think he should have stood his ground more firmly? Or was his strategic retreat the wiser choice? Comment 1 if you believe the airline crew should be held accountable for their actions. Or 2 if you think this kind of treatment is just something minorities need to accept as reality. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, and subscribe to follow this story to its surprising conclusion. Would the airline simply get away with this blatant discrimination? Or would justice be served in an unexpected way? Let's find out as we continue this true story. What Captain Washington didn't realize as he sat rigidly in his row 30 seat was that the universe had placed him next to perhaps the 2 most fortuitous seatmates possible under the circumstances. Dr. Gabriella Thompson wasn't just any passenger. She was one of the country's leading civil rights attorneys, specializing in discrimination cases against major corporations. With her keen analytical mind and 15 years of courtroom experience, she had immediately recognized the textbook discrimination unfolding before her eyes. On his other side sat Tyler Chen, whose unassuming appearance gave no indication that he commanded a social media following of over 3 million people across platforms. As a travel and lifestyle influencer who had built his brand on authenticity and social consciousness, Tyler had discreetly recorded key portions of the incident on his smartphone, careful to capture the expressions and body language that told The true story beyond the words exchanged. I hope you don't mind, Tyler whispered to Derek once they were at cruising altitude. But I recorded what happened. That was textbook discrimination, and people need to see it. Derek looked at him with surprise. He hadn't noticed the recording amidst the humiliation of being forced to move. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure I want to become some viral moment. I just want to get home to my family. From his other side, Gabriella joined the conversation. Captain Washington, I understand your hesitation, but as someone who deals with these cases professionally, I can tell you that staying silent only enables this behavior to continue. She reached into her handbag and produced a business card. Gabriella Thompson, Thompson Civil Rights Law Group. Derek accepted the card, studying it for a moment. You're an attorney. I am, she confirmed. And what happened to you wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. The airline violated multiple federal regulations, not to mention basic human decency. I've seen this before, Tyler added quietly. My father was a doctor who still got treated like a suspect. Every time he walked into high-end stores, he always said not making noise was the safer option. But now I wonder if that's why things never change. The three of them spoke in hushed tones, creating a small island of solidarity amidst the impersonal space of the aircraft cabin. Gabriella explained how she had successfully litigated similar cases, including one against a major hotel chain that had tried to relocate a black executive from a reserved suite based on false claims about his behavior. These incidents follow a pattern, she explained. They never directly mention race because that would be too obvious. Instead, they invent behavioral issues or suddenly discover policy violations that somehow only apply to certain passengers. Tyler nodded in agreement, and they count on other people staying silent. Did you notice how many passengers in first class looked uncomfortable but said nothing? Bystander syndrome, Gabriella supplied. Most people don't want to get involved, especially when it means confronting uncomfortable truths about systems they benefit from. As they continued talking, Derek gradually shared his own experiences, the subtle discriminations he'd faced, even as he rose through the ranks of the Navy. The extra verification his credentials often required, the assumptions people made until they saw his uniform. He spoke of his father's experiences in Vietnam and the complicated legacy of serving a country that didn't always serve you back. The military has its issues, he acknowledged, but there's at least a structure there. Clear rules, defined protocols, and consequences for violations. Out here in civilian life, he gestured around the cabin. The rules seemed to change depending on who's applying them. While they were talking, Tyler's social media posts had begun to gain serious traction, using hashtags like hashtag Captain Washington and hashtag Airline Racism. His initial video snippets had already been shared thousands of times. Comments were flooding in, many from veterans and active duty military personnel outraged by the treatment of a decorated officer. It's starting to blow up, Tyler said, checking his phone. People are demanding the airline respond. Gabriella wasn't surprised. The combination of military respect and blatant discrimination creates a perfect storm. Americans like to think we revere our service members, so when that veneer cracks to reveal the racism underneath, it forces a reckoning. I never wanted to be the center of something like this, Derek said, looking out the small window at the clouds below. I just wanted to get home to my family. Sometimes we don't choose these moments, Gabriella replied thoughtfully. They choose us. The question is what we do with them once they arrive. Throughout the cabin, other passengers who had witnessed the incident were processing what they'd seen. Some were engaged in quiet conversations, expressing disbelief at how the situation had been handled. Others were uncomfortably silent, perhaps examining their own complicity in not speaking up. A few were drafting their own social media posts or emails to the airline, determined to register their disapproval. Meanwhile, in first class, Howard Fitzgerald and his like-minded seatmates congratulated themselves on having maintained standards in their premium cabin, oblivious to the storm that was brewing beyond their privileged bubble. Brenda Collins and Vincent Reynolds continued their duties with smug satisfaction, believing they had successfully handled a difficult passenger. and preserve the exclusive atmosphere of first class. Alicia Martinez, however, was struggling with her conscience as the junior flight attendant. She had watched the incident unfold without intervening, trapped between her employment obligations and her moral compass. During a quiet moment in the galley, she confided to another flight attendant, "What they did wasn't right. He didn't do anything wrong. Don't rock the boat." Her colleague warned, "Brenda has been here forever and has friends in management. Keep your head down if you want to keep this job." Back in row 32, Gabriella was explaining to Derek the potential legal avenues available to him. "This isn't just about you," she emphasized. "Every time discrimination goes unchallenged, it reinforces the system. Your case could help protect the next person who finds themselves targeted for simply existing in a space someone decides they don't belong in." Tyler added his perspective as well. "Your uniform gives this story power. People who might dismiss racism in other contexts can't easily ignore it when the target is someone who represents national service and sacrifice." Derek found himself at a crossroads. His military training had instilled in him a preference for working within systems rather than against them. He had planned to file a formal complaint through proper channels, pursue the matter quietly and professionally. But Gabriella and Tyler were suggesting another approach, using this moment to force public accountability. "Let me think about it," he finally said. "I need to discuss this with my wife before I decide how to proceed." What none of them realized was that the decision was rapidly being taken out of their hands. As the plane continued its journey towards San Diego, the social media firestorm was growing exponentially. Tyler's initial posts had been picked up by several military advocacy groups, veterans forums, and civil rights organizations. Major news outlets were beginning to notice the trending hashtags, and requests for comment were already flowing into the airline's public relations department. By the time the aircraft began its descent into San Diego International Airport, what had begun as one man's humiliating experience was transforming into a national conversation about the intersection of race, military service, and corporate accountability. The story of Captain Derek Washington was about to explode beyond anything he or the airline could have anticipated. The descent into San Diego International Airport should have been a moment of relief for Derek Washington. After weeks away from home and the humiliation he'd endured on the flight, the familiar coastline appearing through the aircraft windows normally would have lifted his spirits. Instead, he sat tensely in his row 30 seat, processing the events of the past few hours and the unexpected allies he had found. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Diego. Local time is 3:45 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." The irony of being thanked by a crew that had publicly humiliated him wasn't lost on Derek. The aircraft captain, James Wilson, made no mention of the incident that had occurred under his command, maintaining the fiction that this had been a routine flight where all passengers had been treated with dignity and respect. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off," the announcement continued. "We know you have many choices when you fly, and we appreciate you choosing us for your travel needs today." As the plane taxied to the terminal, Brenda Collins made one final pass through the cabin. When she reached row 32, she pointedly ignored Derek, addressing only the passengers beside him. The message was clear even after landing. He remained invisible in her eyes. "They're going to hold you until everyone else deplanes," Gabriella whispered, recognizing the tactic from other discrimination cases she had handled. It's one last power move. True to her prediction, when the seatbelt sign finally dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Vincent Reynolds appeared at Derek's row. "Sir, we ask that you remain seated until all other passengers have deplaned. It's for everyone's convenience. Is that standard procedure for all passengers in uniform?" Derek asked pointedly. Vincent ignored the question. "Just remain in your seat, please." Tyler Chen, still beside Derek, spoke up. "I'll stay with you." "Captain Washington, I'm in no rush. He gave Vincent a deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure this has nothing to do with the videos I posted that are currently going viral." Vincent's expression flickered momentarily before he composed himself and moved away. As predicted, Derek was forced to wait while every other passenger left the aircraft, a final humiliation designed to minimize the chance of him interacting with first-class passengers in the jetway or terminal. When Derek finally powered on his phone after deplaning, it immediately began buzzing with notifications. Text messages from Eleanor asking if he was okay. She had already seen footage of the incident online. Calls from fellow officers who had recognized him in the videos spreading across social media. Emails from military advocacy groups offering support. "It's everywhere," Tyler confirmed, checking his own phone. "My posts have over 100,000 shares already, and major news outlets are picking it up. Hashtag Captain Washington and hashtag Respect Our Troops are trending nationally." The airline's social media accounts were being flooded with comments demanding accountability. Veterans groups were particularly vocal, the incident striking a nerve with service members who saw one of their own being disrespected. While in uniform, military forums across the internet were buzzing with outrage, many members sharing their own experiences of discrimination despite their service. Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters, CEO Sarah Reynolds had been pulled from a board meeting to address the rapidly unfolding crisis. The company's stock had already dropped 3% as investors anticipated the public relations nightmare and potential lawsuits. "How bad is it?" she demanded, striding into the emergency meeting that had been hastily assembled in the executive conference room. The head of public relations, a normally unflappable man named Gregory Mills, looked up from his laptop with a grimace. "It's about as bad as it gets." A decorated black naval officer in full uniform was publicly humiliated and forced to move from his legitimately purchased first-class seat to the back of the plane. "There's video. It's being compared to Rosa Parks in reverse." "Jesus Christ," Sarah muttered. "Tell me it was at least justified." Based on the videos circulating and passenger accounts coming in, no. He was quietly reading a book. Some first-class passengers and our crew apparently just didn't think he belonged there. The legal counsel cleared her throat. "We've received inquiries from 7 major news networks already. The Navy's Public Affairs Office has released a statement supporting Captain Washington and expressing deep concern about the treatment of a decorated officer." Sarah paced the room, her mind racing. "Draft a statement. The usual template. We take these allegations seriously, investigating the matter, committed to providing an inclusive environment for all passengers, blah blah blah." "That's not going to cut it this time," Gregory warned. "This isn't going away with a boilerplate response. We need to get ahead of it with something stronger." As the executives debated their response strategy, Captain Washington was being met at the airport by his wife Eleanor, who had left work early after seeing the videos online. Their children were still in school, thankfully spared from immediately witnessing their father's humiliation. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked as soon as she saw him, reaching up to touch his face. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. "I'm fine," Derek assured her automatically, the response conditioned by years of not wanting to worry his family. Then, more honestly, "Actually, no, I'm not fine, but I will be." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "The videos are everywhere. Derek, the kids' friends have probably seen them by now." Zoe's school called to say she was upset after seeing something on social media during lunch break. This news hit Derek like a physical blow. He had endured the humiliation himself, but the thought of his children witnessing it from afar, seeing their father, someone they looked up to, being treated as less than human, that cut deeper than anything the airline crew had done to him directly. As they walked to the parking garage, Derek's phone rang. The caller ID showed his commanding officer, Admiral Peterson. "Washington," he answered crisply. "Derek, I've seen the videos," the Admiral said without preamble. "This is completely unacceptable. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, sir." "Good. The Navy stands behind you on this. Public Affairs is already drafting a statement, and legal is looking into whether your civil rights were violated while you were in uniform." which could potentially elevate this beyond a private matter. I appreciate the support, sir, but I don't want this to become a circus. Unfortunately, it already has, Admiral Peterson replied. Sometimes we find ourselves in battles we didn't choose. Just know that your chain of command has your back. Take care of yourself and your family. First, we'll handle the rest. As they drove home, Derek and Eleanor passed a local news van heading in the opposite direction, likely on its way to the airport to cover the story. Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel. They're outside our house, she said quietly. Reporters, I counted 3 vans when I left. Derek closed his eyes briefly. The private humiliation had now fully transformed into a public spectacle. His home, his sanctuary, was surrounded by people hungry for a story his story whether he wanted to share it or not. Meanwhile, the airline's initial response had been posted to social media, a carefully worded non-apology that acknowledged concerns raised about a recent customer service incident and promised an investigation while neither admitting wrongdoing nor specifically addressing what had happened. The statement was immediately met with backlash, with commenters calling it insulting and evasive. Within hours, the story had expanded beyond social media to mainstream news coverage. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and every major network was running segments on the incident. The framing varied somewhat by outlet, but the core story remained powerful, enough to transcend the usual partisan divides. A decorated naval officer had been humiliated because of his race while in uniform. By evening, the airline CEO had scheduled an emergency press conference for the following morning. The company's stock had continued to fall throughout the day, closing down 7%. Corporate clients were calling to express concerns about their ongoing contracts, and a major veterans organization had announced a boycott until the airline took concrete action. To address the incident, as Captain Washington finally reached his home, navigating past the reporters with Eleanor running interference, he found himself at the center of a storm he never sought, but now couldn't avoid. What had begun as a personal humiliation had transformed into a national conversation about race, respect, and accountability. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice would be served or whether, like so many incidents before it, this one would fade into the background noise of American life, leaving behind only those directly wounded by it. Can you imagine being the CEO of a major airline when you discover that one of your crews has just humiliated a decorated black naval officer in full uniform, forced him to move from first class to the back of the plane, and the whole incident has been captured on video and gone viral? What would your first thought be? Damage control, legal liability, the plummeting stock price, or perhaps, just perhaps, the fundamental injustice that occurred under your watch? For Sarah Reynolds, CEO of the airline for the past 6 years, the emergency meeting that continued late into the night was a dizzying carousel of crises, each demanding immediate attention. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the corporate headquarters had transformed into a war room, with executives, lawyers, and PR specialists hunched over laptops, phones constantly buzzing with updates from across the country. The Department of Defense has issued a statement, announced Gregory Mills, reading from his tablet. We are deeply concerned by reports of discriminatory treatment toward a uniformed naval officer. The men and women who serve our nation deserve respect both for their personal dignity and for the uniform they wear. We are monitoring the situation closely. Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling the beginning of a migraine. What about the crew involved? Have we identified everyone? The VP of Operations nodded. Brenda Collins, head flight attendant, Vincent Reynolds, chief purser, James Wilson, captain, plus 4 other crew members who were present but less directly involved. Suspend them all pending investigation, Sarah ordered. Full pay for now, but they're grounded until we sort this out. The legal counsel cleared her throat. We should be careful about taking action that could be construed as an admission of guilt before we've completed a formal investigation. And we should be even more careful about appearing to defend racist behavior, countered Franklin Moore, the airline's African-American VP of Customer Experience. The videos are damning. There's no ambiguity here. Franklin had been with the airline for 8 years, steadily advancing despite frequently finding himself marginalized in decision-making processes. Today, he had been initially excluded from the emergency meeting until Sarah had specifically requested his presence, recognizing belatedly that having diverse perspectives in the room might have helped avoid this crisis in the first place. Franklin's right, Sarah acknowledged. The optics of not taking immediate action are worse than any legal concerns about implied admission. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of new information. Captain Washington has retained counsel, announced the legal director, looking up from her phone. Gabriella Thompson from the Thompson Civil Rights Law Group. She's a heavyweight in discrimination cases. A collective groan went around the table. Thompson was known for securing substantial settlements and, more importantly, for refusing confidentiality agreements that would allow companies to bury their misconduct. It gets worse, continued the legal director. We've just learned that Captain Washington has connections in both military and government circles. His former commanding officer is now an assistant secretary of the Navy. His brother-in-law works or a senator on the Armed Services Committee. Sarah absorbed this information with growing alarm. This wasn't just a viral PR disaster, it was potentially a threat to government contracts worth billions. The airline relied heavily on military transport agreements and federal employee travel. If those were jeopardized, CNN, NBC, and Fox News are all requesting interviews with you. Gregory informed Sarah. They want statements for their morning shows. Decline for now, Sarah decided. We need more information before I go on camera. Franklin Moore had been silently reviewing the social media response on his tablet. Now he looked up with a grim expression. We're hemorrhaging credibility with every hour that passes without a substantive response. The boilerplate statement we issued earlier is being torn apart online. What do you suggest? Sarah asked, genuinely seeking his input for perhaps the first time in their professional relationship. Full transparency. Acknowledge what happened. Apologize sincerely. Announce immediate concrete actions. And make it clear that this behavior doesn't reflect our values. Then prove it by what we do next. The meeting continued with debates about legal exposure, potential settlement figures, and messaging strategies. What remained largely unaddressed, except in Franklin's increasingly frustrated contributions, was the human element of the situation, the fundamental wrong that had been done to Captain Washington and what that revealed about the company's culture. As midnight approached, Franklin excused himself from the meeting, ostensibly to use the restroom. Instead, he retreated to his office and closed the door. After a moment of deliberation, he pulled out his personal phone and dialed a number he had obtained through his own sources. Captain Washington, this is Franklin Moore, VP of Customer Experience at the airline. I know it's late, but I felt I needed to reach out personally. What happened to you today was inexcusable, and I want you to know that not everyone in this company stands behind it. The conversation that followed was frank, honest, and off the record. Franklin shared his frustration with the company's defensive posture and provided insight into how discrimination complaints had been handled or mishandled in the past. He revealed that Brenda Collins had been the subject of 3 previous complaints from minority passengers, all of which had been dismissed without serious investigation. They're in crisis mode right now, Franklin explained, but they're more worried about the stock price and government contracts than about addressing the real problem. I'm risking my job by telling you this, but you deserve to know what you're up against. By the time he returned to the boardroom, Franklin had made a decision that could cost him his career, but would allow him to keep his integrity intact if the company wouldn't address its systemic issues voluntarily. Perhaps external pressure would force the necessary changes. Meanwhile, Sarah Reynolds had moved on to reviewing drafts of a more substantive public statement. This needs work, she said, frowning at the carefully hedged language. It's too corporate, too defensive. If we admit fault, we increase our legal exposure, the general counsel reminded her. If we don't acknowledge reality, we lose all credibility, Sarah countered. I've made a decision. We're going to invite Captain Washington to a meeting tomorrow. Face to face, no lawyers. Just a human conversation to hear him out and express our regret personally. Franklin, returning to the room, raised an eyebrow at this development. And if he brings his attorney, then we'll include legal as well. But my hope is that a personal approach might diffuse some of the tension and show our genuine concern. What Sarah didn't realize was that the time for such gestures had already passed. The story had grown beyond a simple customer service incident into a symbol of persistent discrimination in American life. Captain Washington wasn't just an individual seeking redress. He had, unwillingly, become the face of a much larger conversation. As the meeting finally adjourned in the early hours of the morning, executives departed with assignments and action plans. Sarah remained behind, staring out at the city lights, wondering how her company had reached this point. Had there been warning signs she'd ignored, voices like Franklin's that had been marginalized, complaints that had been dismissed as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of a deeper problem? The answers to these questions would soon become painfully clear. For now, she had a few hours to prepare for what promised to be one of the most challenging days of her professional life. Tomorrow, she would face Captain Washington across a conference table and attempt to repair damage that went far deeper than a single incident on a single flight. What would you do if you were in Sarah Reynolds' position? Would you focus on protecting the company's financial interests and reputation? Or would you address the underlying cultural issues that allowed this incident to occur? Would you stand by employees who have worked for you for years, or would you hold them accountable for discriminatory behavior? Comment 1 if you believe companies should prioritize ethical treatment over profits, or 2 if you think businesses should focus primarily on shareholder value. Hit that like button if you believe corporations should be held accountable for fostering inclusive environments, and subscribe to see how this confrontation unfolds. Is there any way for the airline to make this right? Or has the damage to their reputation become irreparable? Let's find out as our story continues. The corporate headquarters of the airline occupied 20 floors of a gleaming glass tower. In downtown Atlanta, the building's sleek exterior projected power and permanence, a physical manifestation of the company's desired image, modern, unshakable, above the fray of ordinary concerns. Today, however, that carefully constructed facade was being tested as Captain Derek Washington arrived for his 10 a.m. meeting with the airline's leadership. Derek had debated whether to accept the invitation. His initial instinct had been to decline, to pursue justice through formal legal channels rather than subject himself to what might be merely a performative exercise in damage control. Gabriella Thompson had advised caution as well. These meetings are usually designed to minimize liability, not deliver justice. She had warned during their preparation session the previous evening. They'll try to manage you rather than address the underlying issues. In the end, Derek had decided to attend, but not alone. Gabriella accompanied him as his attorney, her presence ensuring that whatever transpired would have a professional witness. As they entered the soaring lobby, security personnel identified them immediately clearly. Their arrival had been anticipated. Captain Washington, Miss Thompson, a polished receptionist, greeted them. We'll escort you up to the executive conference room. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent and swift. Derek stood at parade rest, his posture reflecting the military bearing that had become second nature over decades of service. He had chosen to wear his uniform again today, a deliberate choice that served as a visual reminder of who he was and what he represented. When the elevator doors opened, they revealed a reception area decorated with model aircraft and photographs of smiling crew members from diverse backgrounds, an ironic contrast to Derek's actual experience with the airline. A young executive assistant led them down a hallway lined with awards for customer service and corporate citizenship. The conference room door opened to reveal a large oval table where several people were already seated. CEO Sarah Reynolds rose, immediately extending her hand. Captain Washington, thank you for coming. I'm Sarah Reynolds. Derek shook her hand firmly but without warmth. Ms. Reynolds. Introductions continued around the table. The General Counsel, the Head of Public Relations, the Chief Operating Officer. Notably absent were any of the crew members involved in the incident. Also missing, Derek noticed, was any visible diversity. Among the assembled executives, all were white, mostly male, with Sarah being the only woman. Before we begin, Gabriella interjected, I noticed that Mr. Franklin Moore isn't present. As the VP of Customer Experience and the most senior African-American executive in your company, his absence seems significant. Sarah's professional smile faltered slightly. Franklin had a scheduling conflict this morning. He'll be joining us shortly. This was a lie. Franklin had been deliberately excluded from the meeting, his insights deemed unpredictable for such a sensitive discussion. What Sarah didn't know was that he was already on his way, having been tipped off about the meeting by a sympathetic colleague. Well, shall we begin? Sarah suggested, gesturing for everyone to sit. First, Captain Washington, I want to express my personal regret for your experience on our flight. It falls far short of the standards we set for customer service. Derek noted the careful wording, regret rather than apology, falls short of standards rather than discrimination or racism. Already, the language was being sanitized. The reality of what had happened diluted into corporate euphemisms. Ms. Reynolds, he responded evenly, what happened to me wasn't a customer service issue, it was discrimination, plain and simple. I was humiliated and removed from my rightful seat because of my race. Despite being in full military uniform, we're still investigating exactly what happened. The General Counsel interjected smoothly. We wouldn't want to rush to judgment. Without all the facts, Gabriella leaned forward. The facts are quite clear from multiple videos and witness statements. Your crew targeted Captain Washington, fabricated complaints about his behavior, and forced him to move to the back of the plane, despite his having a valid first-class ticket. What specific facts are you still investigating? The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. The PR director tried a different approach. Captain Washington, we value your service to our country, and we want to make this right. We'd like to offer you complimentary first-class tickets for future travel and additional frequent flyer miles as a gesture of goodwill. Derek's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. So your solution to racial discrimination is to offer me more opportunities to be discriminated against on your airline. That's not making anything right. At that moment, the conference room door opened and Franklin Moore entered without knocking. I apologize for being late, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. I just learned about this meeting. Sarah's tight smile barely masked her annoyance. Franklin, glad you could join us. We were just discussing potential resolutions with Captain Washington and his attorney. Franklin took the empty seat directly across from Derek, establishing an immediate visual alliance. I hope that discussion includes substantive changes to our policies and culture, not just compensation for a single incident. The corporate unity was beginning to fracture. Exactly what Sarah had feared would happen with Franklin in the room. She attempted to regain control of the narrative. We take these allegations very seriously, she began, falling back on practiced corporate language. They're not allegations. Franklin interrupted. I've reviewed the videos and interviewed other passengers. What happened was real, it was wrong, and it reflects systemic issues within our company that we've ignored for too long. A stunned silence fell over the room. For an executive to break ranks so blatantly during a sensitive negotiation was unprecedented. The General Counsel looked like she might faint, while the PR director was frantically taking notes, probably already drafting Franklin's termination announcement in his head. Gabriella seized the opening. Since Mr. Moore has brought up systemic issues, I should inform you that we've been contacted by 17 other passengers of color who experienced similar discrimination on your airline. In the past year alone, we're prepared to file a class action lawsuit naming not only the company, but also individual executives who fostered a culture where such incidents were tolerated. She placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Sarah. This contains just a sampling of the evidence we've gathered, including internal emails showing that complaints about Ms. Collins' treatment of minority passengers were repeatedly dismissed. Without proper investigation, Sarah stared at the folder as if it might bite her. The General Counsel reached for it, but Gabriella placed her hand firmly on top. Before you review this, I think it's important for Captain Washington to share his perspective, not as a legal claimant, but as a human being who was humiliated while wearing the uniform of the United States Navy. All eyes turned to Derek, who had remained composed throughout the tense exchange. Now, he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and deliberate. "I've commanded nuclear vessels with crews of hundreds. I've made life-or-death decisions in combat situations. I've earned every medal and commendation through service to a country that hasn't always served people who look like me with equal dedication. What your employees did to me wasn't just an insult to me personally, it was a reminder that in some people's eyes, my uniform, my rank, my achievements, none of it matters as much as the color of my skin." The room was utterly silent now, executives shifting uncomfortably as Derek continued. "I'm not here for free tickets or miles or even a settlement check. I'm here because what happened to me happens to people who look like me every day. People who don't have the platform or privilege that my uniform gives me. If I don't speak up, if I don't hold you accountable, then I'm complicit in allowing it to continue." He gestured to the models of aircraft decorating the conference room. "Your company transports millions of Americans every year. You proudly display flags on your planes and talk about connecting people and places. But connection requires respect, and respect has to be more than a marketing slogan." Sarah Reynolds found herself genuinely moved, despite her defensive posture. Before she could respond, Franklin spoke again. "Captain Washington is right. I've spent years trying to address these issues internally, submitting reports, proposing training programs, advocating for better complaint procedures. Each time, I was told it wasn't a priority or that isolated incidents didn't reflect broader patterns. But they do, and now we're facing the consequences of that willful blindness." The confrontation had evolved beyond anything Sarah had anticipated. This wasn't a negotiation anymore, it was a reckoning. The carefully prepared talking points and damage control strategies seemed woefully inadequate in the face of the truth being spoken. "What do you want?" she finally asked Derek directly, setting aside the corporate script. "Not what your lawyer is demanding legally, but what do you personally want to come from this?" It was the first genuine question of the meeting, and Derek recognized it as such. His response would set the direction for everything that followed. "I want accountability not just for the crew members who discriminated against me, but for the system that enabled them. I want structural changes in how you hire, train, and supervise your employees. I want effective, transparent procedures for addressing discrimination complaints. And I want your company to become a leader in creating an aviation industry where everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their appearance." Sarah nodded slowly, processing these demands. They weren't unreasonable, but they would require fundamental changes to how the airline operated, changes that would meet resistance from entrenched interests within the company and the industry at large. "Those aren't simple fixes," she acknowledged. "Discrimination isn't a simple problem," Derek replied, "and throwing money at it won't make it go away." The meeting continued for another hour, the discussion shifting from damage control to substantive reforms. Franklin Moore provided specific examples of previous failures and suggested concrete solutions. Gabriella outlined the legal framework for implementing meaningful changes, rather than cosmetic fixes. Throughout, Derek remained the moral center of the conversation, bringing each proposal back to the fundamental question of human dignity. By the time they adjourned, the power dynamic in the room had transformed. Sarah Reynolds found herself committing to actions that would have seemed unthinkable 24 hours earlier. The corporate defense had crumbled in the face of truth plainly spoken, revealing the hollow core of so many diversity statements and inclusion initiatives. That changed nothing fundamental about how the company operated. As Derek and Gabriella prepared to leave, Franklin approached them privately. "This is just the beginning," he warned. "There will be resistance. Some people would rather see the company fail than admit the system needs changing. Then they shouldn't be in positions of power," Derek replied simply. The confrontation had been won, but the real battle for transformation was just beginning. As Captain Washington stepped back into the elevator, he carried with him not just the weight of his own experience, but the responsibility of ensuring that this moment led to genuine change rather than becoming just another corporate scandal, forgotten after the next news cycle. In the days following the confrontation, At airline headquarters, a thorough investigation into the incident began unfolding on multiple fronts. What had started as an internal review quickly expanded as external pressure mounted. The airline formed a special committee led by independent consultants to interview everyone involved, from passengers who had witnessed the discrimination to crew members who had participated in or observed it. Brenda Collins, the head flight attendant who had initiated the confrontation with Captain Washington, was among the first to be interviewed. Seated in a conference room with HR representatives and an attorney from the airline's legal department, she maintained an air of indignation rather than remorse. "I was simply following protocol for disruptive passengers," she insisted, her voice tight with defensiveness. "His behavior was making other first-class passengers uncomfortable." "What specific behaviors?" asked Diana Chen, the independent investigator brought in to lead the inquiry. "According to our interviews with 12 passengers seated in first class, Captain Washington was reading quietly when you first approached him. Body language can be threatening," Brenda replied vaguely. Several passengers expressed concerns. "We have statements from all first-class passengers," Diana countered, consulting her notes. Only one Howard Fitzgerald reported feeling uncomfortable with Captain Washington's presence, and he has a documented history of making racially charged complaints about minority passengers in premium cabins. Brenda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Well, there were nonverbal cues that don't show up in passenger statements." As the interview continued, Brenda's account became increasingly contradictory. She claimed to have been enforcing company policies but couldn't cite specific guidelines that Captain Washington had violated. She insisted she would have treated any passenger the same way, but couldn't provide examples of similar actions taken against white passengers. Vincent Reynolds, the chief purser who had escalated the situation, presented a different strategy during his interview. "I was responding to Brenda's assessment of the situation," he explained, attempting to distance himself from the decision-making. As the head flight attendant, she has primary responsibility for passenger interactions. "I was supporting her authority." "Did you personally observe any disruptive behavior from Captain Washington?" Diana asked. "Not directly, no," Vincent admitted. "But Brenda is one of our most experienced crew members. I had no reason to question her judgment, even when it meant removing a uniformed military officer from his assigned seat based on complaints that weren't documented and behaviors no one else observed." Vincent stared at the table, unable to formulate a defense that didn't implicate either his judgment or his character. The most revealing testimony came from Alicia Martinez, the junior flight attendant who had witnessed the entire incident, but had initially remained silent after being assured that whistleblower protections would shield her from retaliation. She provided a detailed account that contradicted the claims made by her senior colleagues. "Captain Washington did absolutely nothing wrong," she stated firmly. "He was polite, calm, and cooperative even when being treated disrespectfully." Brenda has a history of similar behavior toward passengers of color, especially in premium cabins. She makes comments in the galley about people who don't belong in first class. "Have you reported these comments before?" Diana asked. Alicia nodded. "Twice. Both times I was told it was a personality conflict and advised to focus on my own performance rather than monitoring my colleagues." This pattern of dismissed complaints emerged as a central theme of the investigation. As more crew members were interviewed, it became clear that Brenda's behavior was well known among staff, but had been repeatedly overlooked by management. Several flight attendants of color shared their own experiences of working with her, describing a persistent pattern of biased treatment toward both colleagues and passengers. Meanwhile, James Wilson, the captain of the aircraft, faced his own reckoning. As the highest authority on the plane, he had the power to intervene in the situation, but had chosen to remain in the cockpit, delegating all passenger issues to his cabin crew. The captain bears ultimate responsibility for everything that happens on his aircraft, Admiral Peterson stated during a press conference about the Navy's response to the incident. If Captain Wilson was aware of the situation and chose not to intervene when a fellow officer was being discriminated against, that represents a serious abdication of leadership. The FAA launched its own investigation, focusing on whether the airline's culture compromised safety by encouraging crew members to prioritize certain passengers over others, and by creating an environment where junior staff felt unable to raise concerns about inappropriate behavior. As the investigations proceeded, additional videos from other passengers emerged, providing even more damning evidence. One clip clearly showed Howard Fitzgerald leaning over to another first-class passenger and saying, "These upgrades are getting out of hand. First class used to mean something," while glancing meaningfully at Captain Washington. Another video captured Vincent telling Brenda, "Handle it quickly before we take off," suggesting that the decision to remove Derek had been made before any alleged disruptive behavior could have occurred. The most damaging revelation came from the cockpit voice recorder, which captured a brief exchange between Captain Wilson and his first officer. After being informed of the situation, "Should we get involved?" the first officer had asked. "Let the cabin crew handle it," Wilson had replied. "Not our problem if they wanted to bump someone back to coach." Even a Navy captain in uniform, especially that one, those types always cause trouble. This recording, obtained through the FAA investigation, shattered any remaining doubt about the motivations behind the incident. It wasn't about behavior or policy or passenger comfort, it was about who belonged in which spaces. Judgments made based on appearance rather than character or credentials. As these details became public, the consequences began to cascade. Military officials, initially measured in their responses, became increasingly vocal in their condemnation of the airline. The Department of Defense announced a review of its contracts with the company, which provided chartered flights for military personnel and cargo worth hundreds of millions annually. Congressional hearings were scheduled, with representatives from both parties eager to position themselves as defenders of military dignity. The House Armed Services Committee issued subpoenas for airline executives, including Sarah Reynolds, to testify about the company's policies and culture. The incident also catalyzed a broader movement. Other victims of discrimination came forward with similar stories, not just about this airline, but about the aviation industry as a whole. Social media filled with accounts from passengers of color who had been questioned about their first-class tickets, asked to move from exit rows despite meeting all requirements, or subjected to additional security screening without cause. These stories created a powerful counter-narrative to the airline industry's carefully cultivated image of glamour and egalitarianism. Behind the polished advertisements of diverse, smiling passengers lay a reality where bias influenced who was welcomed in premium spaces and who was treated with suspicion. For the airline specifically, the financial impact was severe and immediate. The stock price continued its downward trajectory as investors calculated the potential costs of lawsuits, lost contracts, and damaged reputation. Corporate clients, sensitive to association with negative publicity, began shifting their business travel to competitors. The board of directors called emergency meetings to discuss the company's survival strategy. Franklin Moore, who had risked his career by speaking truth to power, found himself unexpectedly elevated rather than sidelined as public pressure mounted for visible changes in leadership. Sarah Reynolds announced his appointment to lead a new diversity and inclusion initiative with substantial authority and resources. "This isn't about checking boxes or issuing statements," Franklin said in his first press conference in the new role. "This is about fundamentally changing how we operate as a company, from hiring practices to training programs to accountability systems." 10 days after the initial incident, the airline announced the termination of Brenda Collins, Vincent Reynolds, and Captain James Wilson, along with several executives who had failed to address previous discrimination complaints. The announcement marked the beginning rather than the end of the reckoning, a public acknowledgement that the problem went beyond individual bad actors to systemic failures. For Captain Derek Washington, watching these developments from the relative calm of his home in San Diego, the experience was bittersweet. The validation of his experience came at the cost of public exposure he had never sought. Yet he recognized that his position of relative privilege, his rank, his uniform, his professional achievements had created an opportunity for accountability. that many victims of discrimination never received. Sometimes change requires a catalyst, Gabriella told him during one of their strategy sessions. Your case became that catalyst because it exposed contradictions people couldn't ignore. How can we claim to honor military service while disrespecting those who serve? How can companies promote diversity in advertisements while enabling discrimination in practice? As the reckoning expanded beyond his individual case to address deeper patterns, Derek found himself becoming something he had never aspired to be, a symbol of both injustice and the possibility of redemption. The question now was whether this moment would lead to lasting transformation or whether, like so many before it, it would fade into memory without fundamentally altering the structures that had made it possible. 6 months after the incident that had thrust him unwillingly into the national spotlight, Captain Derek Washington stood at the podium of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. Before him sat rows of graduating midshipmen in their crisp, white uniforms, their faces reflecting the diverse tapestry of American society in ways that would have been unimaginable when Derek himself had sat in those seats decades earlier. Leadership isn't just about giving orders, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience. It's about standing up for what's right, especially when doing so comes at personal cost. It's about recognizing that the uniform we wear represents ideals that we must strive to uphold, even when especially when our nation falls short of those ideals. The commencement address had not been part of Derek's plans. When the invitation came, his initial instinct had been to decline. He had never sought public attention and had found the scrutiny of the past months both exhausting and uncomfortable. But Eleanor had encouraged him to accept. Your story has meaning for these young officers, she had said. They need to hear from someone who has navigated the complexities of serving a country that doesn't always serve all its citizens equally. So here he was, sharing insights gleaned from both his military career and the unexpected battle he had fought in the civilian world. What happened to me on that flight revealed uncomfortable truths about our society, he continued. But what happened afterward gives me hope. When injustice was exposed to light, people of goodwill from all backgrounds stood up to demand accountability. Systems began to change. Conversations that had been avoided for too long finally took place. In the months since the incident, the airline had undergone a remarkable transformation. Under Franklin Moore's leadership as the newly appointed chief operating officer, the company had implemented sweeping reforms that went far beyond the typical corporate responses to public relations crises. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, underwent comprehensive training on unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. Complaint procedures were overhauled to ensure that allegations of discrimination received proper investigation rather than being dismissed as isolated incidents. Hiring and promotion practices were revised to create pathways for underrepresented groups to advance into leadership positions. Most significantly, the airline established an independent oversight board comprised of civil rights leaders, customer advocates, and industry experts to monitor compliance with these new policies and provide regular public reports on progress and challenges. What had begun as damage control evolved into a genuine commitment to cultural transformation. The impact extended beyond a single company. The incident had sparked industry-wide reforms as other airlines, eager to avoid similar scandals, reviewed their own practices and policies. Trade associations developed new standards for inclusive customer service, and regulatory agencies increased scrutiny of how airlines handled discrimination complaints. For Derek personally, the aftermath had opened unexpected doors. When the airline offered a substantial financial settlement, he declined individual compensation in favor of establishing a scholarship program for minority youth interested in careers in aviation and military service. The program, named not for himself but for his father Harold Washington, whose Vietnam service had often gone unrecognized, would provide opportunities for students who might otherwise never consider such paths. His collaboration with Gabriella Thompson extended beyond his own case. Together, they developed educational programs for corporations about the real-world impacts of discrimination and the business case for inclusive practices. These workshops, initially created for the airline industry, were now being adapted for hospitality, retail, and healthcare organizations. Tyler Chen, whose viral videos had first brought the incident to public attention, used his expanded platform to highlight similar issues across industries. His social media channels, once focused primarily on travel and lifestyle content, evolved to include regular features on corporate social responsibility and consumer advocacy. The most profound change, Derek told the midshipman, has been in the countless conversations that have taken place in boardrooms and break rooms, in classrooms and living rooms. When we bring hidden biases into the open, we create the possibility of addressing them honestly rather than pretending they don't exist. He described how, just weeks earlier, he had boarded another flight deliberately choosing the same airline and experienced a transformed atmosphere. The diverse flight crew, led by a captain who made a point of personally welcoming him aboard, demonstrated through their actions rather than just words that lessons had been learned and changes implemented. Alicia Martinez, the junior flight attendant who had found the courage to speak truth during the investigation, had been promoted to chief purser and was developing new training modules based on her first-hand experiences. She had written to Derek, thanking him for standing firm in a way that created space for others to do the same. Your greatest tests as leaders may not come in combat or crisis, Derek continued, addressing the midshipmen directly. They may come in quiet moments when you must decide whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to challenge a wrong or look the other way for the sake of convenience or comfort. In his own career, that moment of truth had come unexpectedly on a routine flight, but such moments await all of us, in various forms and contexts. True leadership means being prepared to meet them with courage and integrity. Derek's speech received a standing ovation from the graduating class. Among them was his daughter Zoe, now 16 and more determined than ever to follow in her father's footsteps. She had watched her father navigate the aftermath of the incident with the same steady dignity he brought to every aspect of his life, and that example had only strengthened her resolve to serve. What the midshipman didn't know, and what Derek had shared with only his closest family and colleagues, was that he had recently been informed of his selection for promotion to Rear Admiral. The achievement was historically significant. Black admirals remained rare in the Navy's upper echelons, and personally meaningful as the culmination of decades of excellence. Admiral Peterson had delivered the news personally. This was in motion before the incident. He had clarified, "Your promotion is based on your service record, not recent publicity. But I can't help thinking that the attention brought to your character through that unfortunate event only confirmed what your superiors already knew. You represent the best of what the Navy can be." After the commencement ceremony, Derek found himself surrounded by young officers eager to share their own experiences and seek his guidance. Many were from minority backgrounds and spoke of challenges they had faced both within and outside the service. Their stories reminded him of conversations he'd had with his own father, the intergenerational dialogue about progress made and progress still needed. Later that evening, as he and Eleanor drove home, she reached over to squeeze his hand. "Your father would have been so proud today," she said softly. Derek nodded, emotion tightening his throat. His father hadn't lived to see this day, but his influence echoed through everything Derek had accomplished and everything he had stood for when tested. The next morning, Derek prepared for another flight, this time as a passenger in uniform, heading to Washington for meetings related to his upcoming promotion. As he approached the airline counter, he was greeted by name by the staff who had clearly been briefed about his rival. "Good morning, Captain Washington. We're honored to have you flying with us today," the gate agent said with genuine warmth. "We've upgraded you to first class, and the captain would like to speak with you before boarding if you have a moment." The aircraft captain, a woman in her 50s named Rebecca Daniels, greeted him with a respectful nod. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said. "What happened to you led to changes that were long overdue in our industry. Flying is safer and more professional for everyone now because you had the courage to hold us accountable." As Derek boarded the plane, he noticed the chief purser was none other than Alicia Martinez, whose testimony had been crucial in the investigation. She beamed with pride in her new role, confidence replacing the tentative demeanor she had shown during their first encounter. "Welcome aboard, Captain Washington," she said, escorting him to his first-class seat with professional courtesy. "It's good to see you again. Under better circumstances." The flight itself was unremarkable in the best possible way, just routine. Respectful service extended equally to all passengers regardless of appearance or background. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Derek gazed out the window at the landscape below, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The incident that had begun with humiliation had catalyzed meaningful change, not just in corporate policies but in individual lives. The new training programs, developed with his input, were helping crew members recognize and address their unconscious biases. The scholarship program in his father's name was creating opportunities for young people who might otherwise never consider aviation or military careers. His collaboration with Gabriella had expanded to address discrimination in other industries. Most importantly, his children had witnessed their father transform an injustice into an opportunity for broader change. They had seen that standing up against discrimination wasn't just a matter of personal dignity, but a contribution to the ongoing work of creating a more just society. As the plane began its descent into Washington, Derek thought about the many forms courage can take. There's the dramatic courage of the battlefield, which he had witnessed in fellow officers during his deployments. But there's also the quieter courage of speaking truth in everyday moments, of naming injustice rather than accommodating it, of insisting on dignity not just for oneself but for all. That second kind of courage, he had come to believe, was just as essential to the health of a nation as the more celebrated valor of combat. And it was available to every citizen, in uniform or not, in countless daily opportunities to choose justice over convenience, inclusion over privilege, humanity over prejudice. The legacy of what had happened on that flight 6 months ago would continue to unfold in ways he couldn't fully predict. But of one thing Derek Washington was certain: the uniform he wore had never represented American ideals more truly than when he had stood firm against discrimination, insisting that the promise of equal treatment under law applied not just in theory but in practice, not just in military spaces but in civilian life, not just in aspirational speeches but in ordinary moments on ordinary days. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union happens not just in grand gestures and historic moments, but in the accumulated choices of individuals who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable or discrimination as acceptable, who insist through word and deed that we can and must do better. Captain Washington's story teaches us that dignity cannot be measured by rank or uniform, but must be accorded to every human being regardless of their appearance. When we witness discrimination, silence is complicity. The airline crew who remained silent were as responsible as those who actively discriminated. True change requires courage, the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Accountability matters. Without public exposure and legal pressure, the airline would have continued its discriminatory practices. Sometimes justice requires shining light on injustice. Systems don't change by themselves. The discrimination Captain Washington faced wasn't just about individual bias, but about corporate culture that tolerated such behavior. Real transformation demands examining and dismantling structures that enable discrimination. Most importantly, this story reminds us that one person's stand for dignity can ripple outward, creating opportunities for others to speak their truth. Captain Washington didn't seek to become a symbol, but his refusal to accept injustice opened doors for many who had suffered silently. The ultimate measure of progress isn't in policies written, but in lives changed. In the young officers inspired by his example, in the airline employees now trained to recognize their biases, and in everyday travelers who can move through the world with the dignity they deserve. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and felt powerless to stop it? Or perhaps you've been the target of prejudice yourself. Captain Washington's journey reminds us that speaking truth to power can create meaningful change beyond what we might imagine. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever stood up against injustice or wish you had? What gave you courage or held you back? Comment respect if you believe our military personnel deserve dignity regardless of their race or background. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of courage and transformation in the face of discrimination. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters in the ongoing struggle for equality. Thank you for watching, and remember, in a world where injustice often seems overwhelming, even small acts of courage create ripples that can eventually transform systems. Stay strong, stay vocal, and never stop believing in the power of dignity.